Welcome back. I'm Kathy Young, the Executive Director of the New York State Center of Excellence for Food and Agriculture at Cornell Agritech, also known as the COE. Next up is a conversation on how innovators are helping New York shift to a bio-based economy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jillian Goldfarb, Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies at Cornell University, to moderate the conversation. And if you want to add a question or comment, you can do so by logging in to the attendee hub and selecting the chat icon to the right of the viewing screen. Welcome, Dr. Goldfarb.
Conversation like that.
I know, we're so far. So these are, it's my pleasure to introduce everyone today. To first, Dr. Adam Heinze. He's the Director of Operations for My Forest Foods, a startup which is basically going to replace your bacon with mushrooms. And I'm going to let him do his own introduction.
All right, so my boss told me I should have a couple of slides so I stay on script, and I think there might be somebody out there who might show a couple of them if I say those words. There they are. So what we do at My Forest Foods, I am Adam Heinze, I'm the Director of Operations. I spent about 10 years in academia. I studied algae for a while and decided that I really liked some metrics. So I really like to drive towards a goal, and academics' goals are sometimes hard. Take a human who doesn't know a lot and teach them some things and do it well. It's a little easier for me to say, hey, produce 6,000 pounds of meatless whole-cut meat out of mycelium with a couple of ingredients. So we take a plant-based food, mycelium, and we take a couple of different ingredients and we convert it into bacon. And your brain is pretty simple. You find a little salt, you find a little sizzle, you smell like smoke, and you think it's bacon. And that's what we do, right? And you know, some lady in marketing helped me make this sizzle, so if that looks great, just make sure that Sarah knows. But we just take mycelium, which is a mushroom, we take some sugar, we take some salt, we take some beet juice because your brain likes to see, hey, mushrooms are sort of white, bacon is sort of brown. Beet juice is a great way to do that. A little bit of natural flavor and a little bit of coconut oil just to give it that sizzle. We know for sure that we use at least a third less CO2. We use 98% less land and 99% less water. These are going to be critical resources as we move forward, and ultimately what we look to grow is a texture. So we grow something that doesn't remind you at all of a mushroom at all. What this reminds you of potentially is like a memory foam mattress. And so the beautiful portion of this is we can grow a texture inside an indoor vertical agriculture room. And this texture can do a lot of things. One thing this texture can do is trick your brain into thinking you're a whole cut meat. And as we talked about before, you know, we have less land use, less water use, et cetera, so we're really into it. These are the things I know most about, but I was told also, because we're talking about the economy and we're talking about bio-based, some of our sister companies produce a variety of things. So the item here on the right is packaging that's fully compostable. Anything you can do with styrofoam, you can do with our mycelial-based packaging. We call that material mush pack. Typically, we bind some sort of agricultural waste with some mycelium, and the hard part is to get that mushroom to stop growing. So when we put it in the oven at about 500 degrees for a little bit, and it stops. And we can have it form anything you want. Lots of people who like to use it are people who produce high-end alcohol, some people who do some skincare things, people who are very interested in the perception of you know, being ecologically minded, and we believe it's super ecologically minded, but currently it's not quite as cheap. So, you know, if somebody's willing to pay a couple of, you know, extra pennies for packaging, we're happy to help fulfill that. The other item that we produce on the other side there is leather. And so leather obviously comes at the cost of cattle. At some point in time, it was easy to use as a waste product. We might make a lot of meat, and there was a lot of leftover leather. So many people like leather, and it is so common these days that there are actually needs for other leather. We can grow leather out of mycelium, which is really handy. And the process is pretty straightforward. So nature does some cool stuff. And we can go through nature and we can find, hey, here's a Ganoderma. Hey, here is a reishi. Hey, here is a king oyster mushroom. We take that out of nature, and then we bring it into the lab. And we try a couple of things where we might be like, hey, I'm going to tweak this idea or that idea. And maybe on one side, I might end up with a texture that I like better. On another side, I might end up with a texture that I like worse. Maybe I want it to be bulby. Maybe I want there to be some character to it. Maybe I want it to be very, very uniform. And so we take those things, and then we scale it up. And then we use very traditional indoor agriculture methods that are common in the mushroom industry, and we grow our mycelium off of that. And yeah, that's what I have for me. I think I might be close to time. So yeah, thank you.
That's great, thank you. And our second panelist today is Dr. John Reich. He's from the Scientific Program Director for the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research. And I'd like him to share a few words about what it is that he does and what motivates him.
Yeah, so I am John Reich, as you mentioned. I'm a scientific program director, working mainly on urban food system, but other areas at the foundation. So I work for the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and we're a research funding organization with the purview of building public-private partnerships to spur innovation in food and agriculture. So, and we work all over the spectrum in food and agriculture. So we get our money from Congress and the US Congress, and we can't release our money unless we have matching support from the private sector. So that's really one really big, important part of what we do. We fund in a number of different ways. Everything that we do is peer reviewed, but we can fund direct funds to groups. We can have a competitive RFA process. We also build consortia. So we build funding consortia, which are companies come together or organizations come together. We pool our money together, decide what we're going to fund together, and then fund that research. That's me in a nutshell.
Thank you. So we have an academic, industry, and I guess foundation and science research on the stage. And our goal today is to talk a little bit about kind of the challenges and opportunities that the bioeconomy lays out before us. So a bioeconomy is the idea that we would have an economy where the basic building blocks of materials are really from renewable biological resources. As a biofuels and biomaterials person, this is close to my heart. So I really hope that our audience will get some questions ready. I'll ask a few to get things going and really help direct this conversation. So my first question goes over to Adam. New York State has some pretty ambitious goals to shift to this bio-based economy by the year 2050. What role do you think innovation in the biomaterials sector could play in driving these kind of economic opportunities for both farming and food production?
Sure. So, you know, remarkably, our business, we turn mushrooms into food, which is actually not that hard because people think of mushrooms as food. What's a little harder is how we might go about, you know, looking at processing those sorts of things. And so as we're looking to process and make sure we understand, it is very important that there are really clear guidelines as to kind of how we can enter into the market. And so for us, as I said, it's very straightforward. It's mushroom, sugar, salt, beet juice, coconut oil, and some natural flavor. It's really straightforward. And to make sure that all of the rules are well understood, you know, in the styrofoam market that we're in, it would be really easy immediately for us to sell out of our product all of the time if people had to recycle their styrofoam. If every time you went to Target and you bought a television, you had to recycle those corners and Target or someone was responsible for that, immediately our product would sell out, right? In Great Britain, they did something very similar, and immediately our product sold out, right? Essentially, we cannot meet demand to the extent that we mail some things, some general products from New York State, where we're doing some things, over to Great Britain, right? And that is based simply on a regulatory measure. The moment that that goes through for that, we're set. The hog industry, for a long period of time, has had some great relationships, right? If we talk about pork, in some spending aspects, that's actually determined based on the pork lobby being able to actively and effectively advocate for their market. Very excited to have pork advocate for American production of agricultural products that end up getting shipped to Asia, that end up getting shipped places. Super exciting to me. I think that we have goals that we're interested in. Hey, clean water is important to all of us. Hey, clean air is important to all of us. Hey, good, safe working conditions, careful for all of us. You know, today, we have chosen to not be a part of the Farm Bill, which I think, you know, we have chosen to not go agricultural. If we would do agricultural, there are child labor laws that change. You can be younger and work on a farm. We've chosen to not do that because we think it's the wrong thing. There are issues with how you discharge waste that don't sort of, you know, but in terms of making sure that we understand What are the rules of the game and how can we comply with that? That would be really great. We're a mid-sized startup. We're really sort of, but there aren't a team full of lobbyists and lawyers sitting in the back room saying, ooh, I wonder if the senator from West Virginia would be willing to do such and such if we did such and such, right? And I don't think that's the world we want to be in. I think that innovation is about sort of pushing the product, and I would love for people, in this room to first think that, our bacon is a cool product, maybe then come and talk about working with us and see what we can change, and then also working together to kind of make a better way in which it's easy for us to enjoy a delicious breakfast meat.
So more collaboration, better policy, and maybe some actual recycling to get to better bacon.
That would be great for me if I get to write the rules.
So I like this idea of writing our own rules. And I'm kind of wondering, to both of you, but maybe we could start with John, is in terms of these rules and other risks and challenges, what do you see that needs to change to make a future bioeconomy possible?
Well, one of the things that I hear a lot when I'm out talking to stakeholders and developing our own initiatives is that if you're going to create a product, you need to make sure that product has a market, right? You need to make sure you have the feedstocks of the volumes that you need them, as you know better than I do. I'm pretty sure you do know this better than I do. And all of those other issues that come along with that, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point in time. I would also say, when I think about the bioeconomy and I think about innovation in the bioeconomy, I do think about who the owners of these types of systems are going to be and who gets the chance to be entrepreneurs or whatever. And I think that innovation really comes from diffusion of knowledge to the masses, to different groups that can actually take that information and innovate for their own particular needs, for their own particular regions, et cetera. So I think that as one area I'm hugely interested in moving forward when we talk about things in the bioeconomy.
I think that makes some sense when you talk about diffusion of information. We're all collectively in this room from really different backgrounds. And when you think about your role and having to make funding decisions, what do you wish we could do differently with that information? How would you change it or just tweak it slightly?
I don't know. That's a hard question. I actually do think about this question a lot. Everything that I do at the foundation is really actually connected. All the programs that I have in my portfolio are connected to one another, at least in my head. And whether it's from vertical farming all the way to helping communities live up to their potential or solving community problems, I think about how we actually connect those diffusions of knowledge to these people who are trying to solve problems in their area. I think it's a very hard question, a very hard thing to do, but I think that with different groups who are kind of innovating, I guess you would say, who are building new models of how communities and places that you're trying to help work, actually going to the people that you're trying to help and then figuring out a way from there. But I think it's a hard question that I don't know if I did know the answer to that, then.
We did.
But getting there, hopefully, eventually.
For sure.
I don't know if I answered your question.
I think it's a difficult question that has no one right answer.
Yeah.
We could probably get 10 different answers if we asked 10 different people. So,
yeah, but in terms of the collaboration part, we at the foundation are very collaborative. So when you were talking about industries collaborating together, that's what we do typically, especially when we build consortia. We bring people together to figure out what the needs are, whether it's from an industry perspective or from a community perspective.
Definitely. So Adam, I'll turn the question back over to you then. What do you think are the major risks or challenges that have us almost at this precipice of a bioeconomy, but not have us there yet? And what do we need to overcome to get there? Yeah,
so today, tomorrow, the next day, I need to understand the rules and I need to follow the rules. And I think that makes a lot of sense. For me, we put clean water down the drain, and I want everybody else to have to do that too. I think that would be amazing, and sometimes that's hard and onerous, and sometimes people feel like that's a system on, right? But there are moments where, if you blow up the top of a mountain and you destroy the streams down below, that can be a way to get energy because we're addicted to a particular version of it. I want us to follow the same rules. That would be really great for me, and to not have a different set of rules for groups that are established and a new set of rules for kind of how we want to do this. It's like, hey, we're going to do something new. I know that we've done this old thing the same way the other time. It's too hard to go back and change the rules for those guys. But we do, as you're doing something new. We're gonna have a new set of rules for you. That's pretty tough. And really boringly, labor, right? Like, you know, it would be great to make sure that, you know, people who see us are excited about what we're doing, are excited about the work that we can do, are excited, you know, we think that we can change the way food is made. This is probably broadcast somewhere. I hope my boss isn't watching. I don't care that much if My Forest Foods wins the meatless race. What I care about is that we have good alternative options so that my daughter, that my grandchildren can have sort of great tasting, effective breakfast foods that people agree with. You know, if you want to have bacon for lunch or dinner, you know, we may have jerky at some point, we may have salmon at different points. But in terms of how to make that work, I think that one of the challenges is just making sure that people understand and realize that this isn't like a cool startup thing that we're doing, but this is a way in which you can kind of set and move towards a career. Because today, you know, if I'm 22 years old, have a, you know, a great GPA, and, you know, if the question is, do I go work for GE up the road, or do I come down and work for, you know, there's some risk with us. GE is gonna be here in 15 years, right? Like, we may or may not be here in 15 years. I certainly hope we are. I wouldn't put my bet sort of in this system if I didn't think that was true. But there is some risk involved there. And so, you know, just making sure that it's really clear like what the risk and opportunities are. And I think the opportunities are huge. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. But, you know, that's where we sit, you know.
So I'll ask a selfish question as the academic, but because I also know we have a lot of academics online watching us. How do we re-envision the education and training system? So everything from K through 12 to our technical programs to community colleges to places like Cornell, how do we re-envision this to provide the workforce you need? Or is it just too big of a question? We talk about this all the time and we don't know the answer.
Sure. You know, I think part of it is, and I think, you know, I think a lot of the work with the public-private partnership, right? I think the question is, let me make it a little simpler. For me, you know, in terms of my daily life, you know, our company is founded by engineers, and a lot of times the engineers get to go and sort of be excited about the thing it is they're doing. And so there are sometimes problems that I got a hammer out there looking for a nail, right? And the question isn't like, hey, where's a nail, right? The question is like, well, what tool do I need? Oh, that's a screw. Maybe I should go get a screwdriver. And so I think from the terms of a K through 12 education system, right? When you look at that, like, we know that you have to be literate, right? And we know that you need to be literate by 3rd grade, right? And so if there are people in our system that are not literate by the 3rd grade, we have to change that, right? There is no question about how that's going to work. I think in terms of looking at as we get towards the end of the process, right? I shouldn't say this out loud. This is probably a Cornell crowd. I came from Pennsylvania. The Penn State system has a program called Wood Products, right? Wood Products majors are hugely in demand. There are 12 jobs for every 10 majors that develop, right? And so if you're talking to an 18-year-old about, hey, what is it you want to do with your life? I want to help people, I want to do this, I want to do that. The question is, if you don't know what you want to do and you know for sure you want to have a job, do something that is wood products. That's taking wood pulp, gluing it together and making different versions of MDF. Profoundly boring, right? Very well paid, highly engineered. And the question in terms of looking at the labor market and how we might want to kind of guide the labor market, from my perspective is, like, you know, look around. Find groups of people to be like, what is it you need 5 years from today? And reevaluating. Academia, at least from my perspective, never turns at 5 years, right? It's more like maybe a 25 or 30 year sort of shift. But I think sort of being responsive to the sorts of things that we might need, but then you end up with a problem of being like, well, if all you know how to do is operate a screwdriver, what is the question of, you know, how to use a hammer? And I think for me, my perspective, you know, kind of my mantra is, you know, I solve problems one bite at a time. So teaching a set of problem solving, sort of, et cetera. I don't use a lot of reference citing software in my daily work today. It was very valuable when I'm writing papers to have reference citing software. And so knowing what the right tool is that I need can be very useful, but I don't know how to make the system sort of more nimble, If you can figure that out, I think we've solved a lot more than we'll get in an hour here. We probably should.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
And what do you think? What would you change, kind of putting on your lens of working on these public-private partnerships and beyond just the technical and the engineering side? What would you change about how we're building a workforce these days?
I don't know that either. I think that a lot of things I look about, like when I work with, when I go out and I talk to community groups who are trying to build stuff, a lot of people trying to build stuff in urban agriculture, right? And come with these grandiose visions of how you can change society, but farming is a low margin business, right? So if you're trying to get into that business, you have to kind of realize that. And one thing, especially with all those types of entrepreneurial people that we have in the system, so I'll use an example. A lot of them will talk about vertical farming. You hear about vertical farming everywhere. I have a consortium on vertical farming, but adapting plants to indoor systems, which I really like the field. But they talk about growing like leafy greens and things like that, and part of the time I don't think they actually realize the potential of a field like that, which is environmental conditions control phytochemicals, which can be important for health, can be important for production of materials, et cetera. And that kind of like, again, that fusion of knowledge to them to know like that these things could be potentially possible for them, and partnering with the right people, with mentors, with academics, with people in the business industry, I think are really important. Yeah.
So what you're saying is I have to teach my students to solve every problem by knowing how to approach a problem and the people.
Yeah.
Sounds like easy peasy, we got this. Shall we move on? So I'm wondering, John, maybe you can follow up on that. What role does the community play in innovating for the future bioeconomy, and how do we facilitate this? How do all of us facilitate it, and how do you do it in your role?
Well, I think that when we're developing new types of technologies or products that are supposed to serve a community, that you should probably talk to those communities, right? And so if there's an issue with like contamination in soils, like large-scale contamination of any type of things, and we're going to use bioremediation as a part of that, talking to the community and getting them involved and understanding what their needs are in that region to help them, I think is really important. For us, I think I lost my train of thought briefly, but when we look at areas that we're going to fund, is that part of your question? We do talk to a lot of the stakeholders, and our community varies from people in actual communities all the way up to businesses and everybody in between, and talk to them to see where our research dollars can actually go the furthest and what the needs are. And if we're working, so now I'll use an example of an industry. So if we're working with an industry and a bunch of industries who are competitors with each other, it's really important for us to understand what they're not going to invest in that's risky but can really elevate the field. So putting research dollars in that de-risk areas for them and their partners, and they put some of that research dollars in to kind of pursue that line of research that could potentially transform how they operate.
Definitely. I'm glad you mentioned the word stakeholders. So I want to go back to Adam, because a lot of what we've talked about today, and really the focus of Grow New York, is on more startup and kind of early ventures. But you're in a mid-size. You know, you are there, and you're doing this at scale, close too. What type of stakeholder engagement do you see as being critical for the bioeconomy, maybe even more so than more of a traditional petroleum-based product?
Yeah, well, so, you know, people who dwell on Earth, you know, there are just 8 billion of us, so I think those are the primary stakeholders. There are also some other animals and mammals, some bugs, et cetera, that are the primary stakeholders. I think in terms of, you know, I think where food is really interesting is that I think a lot of people are very concerned about what they bring into their body. I think also areas that are interesting are skincare, right? So I don't want words that I can't pronounce on my skin, even if it makes my crow's feet go away. I find that as I'm aging a little bit, I might sort of be careful about those sorts of things. But we don't think as much about sort of the other products in our life, you know, sort of, you know, what a leather product might be in your car You don't think about how much plastic might be in there or the really weird stuff that goes into it and the fact that it cooks in the summer and then you might turn something to heat it on and then like what the chance of that like kind of ending up someplace else might be. And so I think in terms of looking at, you know, the primary stakeholder, I think the people who have the most power and it feels unrealistic are the consumer. So if the consumer says, I will not buy bacon that is more than $5 a pound, then you will only have bacon that costs $5 a pound. There are lots of reasons why you would only have bacon that costs $5 a pound. And you might decide, I only have $5 to spend on meat for today. You might decide which meat you choose to buy. And so for me, as a mid-sized startup, if I don't listen very carefully to what the consumer is asking for, you know, like, I mean, it's, you know, John has to try hard to convince people that you should talk to your stakeholders and that if you're gonna do something weird in a place, I don't have to be convinced to do consumer work. Yeah. If I don't do consumer work, if I don't ask the people what it is they want, right, it would be much easier for me to add some weird items, some nitrates. Because if I add nitrates to my food, it lasts longer. That shortens my supply chain, and I have all sorts of other options. The consumer is very smart and knows to not put things that poison you into your body. The reason nitrates are great is because they poison microbes, and then you don't put them into your body. I then choose to not put nitrates because the consumer has said, hey, you have a really cool thing. I'd like it to not also poison me. And so, you know, at least to me, the key stakeholder, you know, in a business is to find out who the consumer is. And I wish it were more complicated or more high-minded than that. But the answer is that if a TV costs $7 more because it's biodegradable in the box, fewer people are going to buy that TV.
Yeah, a definite culture shift is needed, I feel like, with all of this that we're talking about. So I think back to John, you know, you were talking about I have to go out to all these different stakeholders and my community group members. How, when you're thinking about a new priority area to fund, whether it's the organic farming initiatives or the hen raising initiatives I know that you have going on right now, what do you prioritize? How do you make that decision?
Yeah, so I'll tell you that we do have a board of directors who's very active and help us come up, or help vet decisions. We have advisory councils for all of it. We have 7 challenge areas, advisory councils for all of them that also help us vet those areas. And then we talk to, I think, a tremendous amount of stakeholders, whether they're academics, whether they're from the business sector, or just regular citizens to determine where that would be. And then as we're doing something like that, we try to find out where the gaps are, and we try to find out where we think industry would also be interested in funding. So for instance, I'll use an example of, I created this consortium called the Precision Indoor Plants Consortium. It's a global funding consortium for indoor agriculture to adapt plants to indoor agriculture. At the time of the industry, they were all just focusing on energy costs, which is really important. However, energy is just one part of the equation, and all the economic arguments were like, well, if I grow wheat here, it's not economically viable compared to outside, right? But I would argue if you were growing wheat that was adapted to grow in Kansas and Washington State, then it's probably not going to be as efficient for you there. And so for that, it was, well, maybe if we can start adapting plants to these systems and then start making arguments versus that and a variety of crops to those systems. And so then, you know, after talking to a lot of stakeholders with that, coming to the communities, like through convenings, et cetera, having them generate those ideas. Sometimes you know the ideas before you get there, but it's, you know, it's more powerful when people generate it themselves. Those ideas, and then finding out, okay, well, who wants to partner? So remember I said that we have to, when we fund research, we have to have a non-federal, US federal source of funding to match that to release our dollars. And so it's very important for us to say, okay, what's actually gonna stick and what's gonna elevate this industry as a whole or the sector of food and agriculture production. So that's typically the process that I go through. So lots of stakeholders, we talk to the USDA a lot, our board, our advisory councils, and then, you know, start designing concepts with people in the field who would potentially co-fund those concepts.
Yeah. It's quite the process when you think about it. So I want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for our audience to ask questions, and I think Lauren's been gathering questions for us from online, and if anyone had any to bring over. So if we have any of those, let's see.
All right, I have some collected over here, and we can get started. So the first one's from our online audience. What strategies are being considered for managing competition for input resources for a balanced bioeconomy of food, feed, and fuel production?
That's a tough question.
Yeah, so for me, that's really straightforward because mycelium will grow on just about everything. And so we're attempting to restrict that somewhat. So we're using agricultural waste. So in the traditional mushroom industry, the things you use mostly are literally horse manure. I think I can say that and not have some bleeps over here. Some other people might call it something else. And waste straw, actually. A good chunk of the hay grown in the state of New York is actually for mushroom cultivation. Actually in Pennsylvania. And so for us, the feedstocks are pretty straightforward. And if we get really good at it and we have enough time to figure it out, my personal love would be municipal compost. The reason I would love it is because I don't have to truck it very far. And I'm also diverting it from the landfill. The reason I hate it is because people put plastic and sort things wrong, right? And so if I could put it in a truck, I will say that I sat on the board of a charter school and we ran a competition, and the class that got the most got $300 for a pizza party. And what we measured and what we learned is that in terms of the free and reduced lunch program, you have to give milk. So kids were choosing to not throw away milk. And what they did is they created a share table. And so someone who didn't want the milk would put the milk on the share table, and if it didn't make it to the end, then there would be composting of it. And so I was like, oh, these little entrepreneurs at like 7 years old were figuring out how to game the system. I think in terms of mushrooms, the feedstock at scale is a little tricky, but once we get good at it, today we're using essentially just pellets, and we use a commonly available pellet of soybean is one of the items. And, but I can grow on just about anything, and so that allows diversification of that system. You know, can everybody do it at the scale that, can we replace all meat? No, not today on our current feedstock. We can do 40+% of meat in the United States on our current feedstock and still have enough. I think we'll have a couple of items between now and then. So if we get to 40% meat, we're still okay. I think that's close enough.
I think, you know, one of the things that we've talked about a lot in our research these days is the new New York State food waste recycling law. So producers producing over 2 tons a week within 25 miles of a facility are no longer able to throw this waste out. And, you know, that's an important policy change when you think about making organic feedstocks available in this bioeconomy. Do you see other ways that policy is needed to make this happen?
Probably. I will tell you that my concerns have been more short term. I'm thinking about, you know, 18-month and 36-month sorts of problems as it relates to these things. When I have a little time to come up for air, I would love for you guys to have solved these problems for us. If you would love to fund now some research so that people talk about how to make this compost clean enough for me, I would love that.
Yeah,
that would be great.
Circularity is very important to us as we're thinking about feedstocks, and research plays a huge role in like determining what feedstocks. But in terms of policies, I think, you know, when we're thinking about circularities of systems and the volume of feedstock that we need, and the impurities that go into heterogeneous feedstocks and things like that, I think we have to consider that. But also infrastructure is a very important part of that, depending on what your feedstock's going into. So like having the infrastructure to do that, I think, is important in incentivizing things like that. Do you disagree? Or
no, I agree completely. Everyone knows I like heterogeneous feedstocks. That's
yeah.
Well, one other thing I'd love to add to that is, like, sometimes there are things that we wouldn't traditionally think of as being sort of organically certified if they didn't come from this, from a waste stream. If we could get something like that essentially immediately stocked as organic, that would be amazing, and that is essentially a wave of a wand, right? So like if it was in the trash and it was going to landfill, if we can call that organic immediately, that has huge change for us. And I think that's relatively straightforward.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. That was all fantastic. This next one's for John. I saw your USDA background and wonder what do you think are the most effective ways for idea stage entrepreneurs to get funding for biomaterials startups?
Oh, for biomaterial startups. You know, the government has SBIR programs, right? I think all the funding agencies have SBIR programs. So I think applying to that would probably be the best ways of doing that. And then from there going on to VC funded probably stuff is typically how I've seen people do it.
Well, and in New York, we have NYSERDA.
Yep.
Definitely is a big one. Grew New York, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that one, I'll definitely plug the academic partnerships for startups, right? We're getting pretty good at that.
Yeah. Okay, so this next one is for all of you. Are there specific skills or training that the bioeconomy asks of its workforce?
In a startup, you got to be flexible. I carry a flashlight and a pocket knife and get 1,500 steps. Also have a lot of science background. So the problems that I have this week are very different than the problems of 3 weeks ago. And so being nimble and flexible is really important. I always tell everyone that the job of a resume is to get you an interview. The job of an interview is to get you a job. And so the sorts of things that you might look at on a resume for me are like kind of, is there some evidence that you showed up to something more than 5 days in a row? You know, so college is one of those things. Hey, you showed up more than 5 days in a row. Does everyone who we've hired in the last little bit have college? Certainly not. Have we hired anybody in the VP suite that doesn't have any college? We have not. You know, and then sort of, you know, as you're discussing items, you know, we had one young woman who applied for every job on the website until we gave them an interview. Molly, if you're out there, we're super glad to have you. Thanks for being persistent. Persistence, at least, you know, in a group that is willing to take some risk, can be very valuable. Also, please don't post my home address on the internet. I'm not looking for that level of persistence, but 70 Cohoes is a place that maybe you could show up in Waterford, New York. Caitlin will be at the door. She probably won't let you in without a COVID test these days, but might accept a resume. And, you know, just say Adam sent you. Just write for Adam on the top. I promise I'll read it if there's a paper copy there. In terms of, yeah, so, you know, for me, you know, it's a matter of sort of, has there been some consistency, and then how flexible do I think a person might be? That's what I'm looking for these days. Innovation is hard. You have to be flexible. We break some people.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, thank you. The next one is there an agreement that addressing food security is paramount?
Ooh, it's a tough one. It's well timed with the COP meeting this week, right?
Yeah, I think I'll start, I guess. Addressing things like food and nutritional security is very important. I think the way that we go about it is also important. And so I often say that when we think about nutritional security, we often focus on emergency food systems, which are very important. And they do a very good job, or you know, or at least with COVID, have done a very good job and continue to do a very good job for meeting those needs. But when I think about nutritional security and food security, I really view it as so I really think that it's poverty through the food system lens, and any way that you can overcome that poverty helps people raise their income. So there's economics, there's a whole slew of things in communities that need to happen that's not necessarily linked to traditionally how we think about a food system, but really is linked to a food system as a whole. So I do think that we need to be able to feed people. We need to be able to feed people nutritious foods, and how we go about that depends on how you, I think, look at the problem. Mm-hmm. But it's very much more complicated than what I just said, and it's much more complicated probably than I can even think about. So,
yeah, I know that's a good question, Adam. I mean, you're working on an alternative protein, essentially, and right now, like, as you said, you know, our product costs more. how in line with that is food security in terms of like developing these products that it costs more than the conventional alternative, but there's an environmental benefit? Kind of where do you fall out on that?
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny. So when I think of initial food security, I think about sort of some FSMA things, like actual like physical infrastructure of the space, right? And so that if you have 9 spaces that produce all of the beef in the United States, that food security is a little bit difficult. When I think about like what it means to write a free and reduced lunch program for a very exciting system, and you have to put it out for bid because that's the law, the phrase handheld fruit written in an RFP is very important, because otherwise in the free and reduced lunch program, you can produce sludge out of a can that anybody can provide for free. So even if you have a great partner, sort of these sorts of things make sense. And so when I think about food security as it relates to sort of how can we get high quality food to communities that don't have the same sort of ability to provide, today we address those issues in sort of a Band-Aid fashion, like within our community, right? So it is very, very important to me that the neighbors to our facilities are very happy with the work that we do. And so that means that, people in our organization sit on the Little League like boards around because they were having trouble getting the Little League boards around. Do I care necessarily that everyone in our community that I live in eats our food every day for breakfast? No. Do I care that the people who live and work in our community feel as though we are an impactful member of the community as opposed to someone that is extracting resources out of the community? That's really critical to me personally. It probably has some business risk, right? So that if I can just dump whatever garbage I want sort of outside of where I sit, whatever runoff goes, sort of, et cetera, it's cheaper. If I want to take care of my neighborhood because I live there, it's maybe more expensive. If that means I have to pass that on to a consumer, am I happy to import someone else's wealth into our community? I am. But, if we are really good at what we do, we will drive the price down. Today, I can't afford to sell it and hire Molly and Kim, et cetera, at below the rate of meat. I think that in 5 years we easily can, but today, it's a blind spot for us.
I mean, that's why we're having this conversation, right? It's the future bioeconomy, and we hope it's the near future. So how do we get to that point, I think, is the question.
All right, so our next one is, New York has vast amounts of forested land. What role do you see the forest playing in the bioeconomy in New York?
Yay, biochar.
Yeah, I mean, you are probably actually the better person to talk about this, but I will mention a couple of things. I do hear a lot about producing biochar from a more homogeneous feedstock that comes from waste that comes from production or probably using all the wrong words for it, through the forestry sector. So I think that could be a really big component of that through things like biochar, exactly what you mentioned.
Yeah. It's your point too of the wood products degree at Penn State. SUNY ESF here is very well known for educating within the forestry field too, and very good careers coming out of that. Isn't the idea of the bioeconomy that we have to use all available natural resources in a sustainable manner, right? There's not just let's not forget that sustainable is kind of a key here to a bioeconomy. If we chop it all down tomorrow and don't have anything to regrow, it's not going to be a thing. So I kind of feel like we're at that precipice where we need to extract products from forestry, from horse manure, from all these ways to make a circular economy, and then to upcycle all those residues. Things like MDF are in some ways not great because we are using chemicals and things to still process boards like that. But at the same way, it's a use for a waste, and that is critically important for a circular economy.
What do you think about like the trade-offs between different things? So for instance, if you're using something that requires a lot of energy, right, and you can offset that somewhere else, and it has like these kind of, if you're thinking about a system as a whole and it has like these kind of net zero or net negative type of things, do you think that it's that we need to be thinking about all those trade-offs as part of a system rather than just like food and agriculture, but other areas?
I hope we all are. I hope we're considering not only the cliche triple bottom line, but that we really do mean this when we're talking about how do we upcycle residues? How do we make sure that we're valorizing everything along the chain? And I think that you and I were talking about earlier, how do you take the waste that's left over from after you grow bacon, and how are you going to upcycle that? And could that even potentially offset the cost if you can make a value-added byproduct from that?
And what's interesting is actually when we looked initially, we were landfilling some of our material, and it drove me absolutely insane. We have several people sort of around. And what was really interesting is that there was a commercial composting facility. It was actually less expensive because our feedstock was so significant. It was less expensive to do commercial composting because we could validate our feedstock. And so, I hate to say it, right, but my values are one potential way, but we're a business ultimately, and so when we can make the values of society match the business incentives, we'll find pretty quickly that we end up there, right? Like, there's been really sort of amazing sort of metrics done for, what you look at a congestion tax, like how quickly you can keep people from driving in an inner city by saying that's $3. Does it mean no one else ever drives again? It does not. It means you decide if you're gonna make that trip or not. Is it a hassle when I'm paying the $3? It certainly is. Is it much less of a hassle when I'm walking to the grocery store? Also, that's nice, right? And so the question is, in terms of like how we look at sort of how we come about and valorize sort of all of these systems, there is a big incentive economically for me to compost because it's easier. I would love to compost in the state of New York as opposed to compost in Shrewsbury, Vermont, right? I would much rather do that. Again, not because necessarily I want to improve the economy of New York, but because it's expensive to move the stuff from point A to point B. So the closer and the tighter we can make that circle, getting soybeans from one place versus another place has a huge impact on the business. And my goal would be is that, with our work, we have 98% less land use. This means I can grow bacon and process bacon in New York City and reduce the cost of distribution by 15%. Just by where I choose to put this. You can't grow pigs in New York City. Doesn't work. I can take 7 abandoned warehouses in Brooklyn and immediately sort of like set up enough food for the city of New York. I can do something similar in Boston, and it's not, and it works to the advantage if fuel is more expensive, if there is sort of new opportunities there, and I don't have to just sort of open the door and be like, oh, just come in and buy it. I don't have to become a retail market. It doesn't have to be a farm stand, right? But you can create systems that look more like a farm stand, at least as it relates to distribution, and the sooner we can do that, right? It's hard because distribution is not exciting or interesting. There aren't people who are sitting going, you know what I want to do when I grow up when they're 9? I want to work on distribution logistics for cold chains, right? No 9-year-old says I want to do distribution logistics for cold chains. Very, very important. And so, you've got to help incentivize someone to be like, that's really cool. I want to do that.
My son's girlfriend actually works on supply chains. She went to college for.
See, so we need to translate that.
Looking for work?
Oh no, I don't think she is. Actually, but I like
because there's plenty of work.
Yeah. I like the incentivizing behavior change is really important. Getting the values of society to catch up to where we need to be, I think, is also.
For sure. So you probably have time for one more or two more?
Yeah, I think we probably have time for one more here. So New York State has ambitions to shift to a bio-based economy by 2050. What do you predict the different milestones will be along the way in that journey, and what are the immediate next steps that the food and ag industry can be taking to facilitate those goals?
That's a huge question that I think we could spend hours on that one.
Yeah, I think so.
What's like one milestone, do you think, that has to come up for this to happen?
Well, I think for me, it would be if you're thinking about what types of, like, say, if you were trying to target the construction industry and targeting cement, it's like one milestone would be getting those types of companies to actually use a bio-based product, right? But another milestone to actually make that happen might be setting up the infrastructure to do that, in addition to funding the research that allows that to make it economically viable to do that. I think you could probably design milestones within each of those. And those, like that's just, you're right, you can talk about this for a long time, actually. That was just something very simple, but.
What do you think?
I mean, for me, the first thing you gotta do is set the target, right? So what does it mean to be a bio-based economy? If that means we reduce carbon by X, if that means we produce more of Y, like having a real clear directive so in the next 25 years, the 9-year-olds of today are mid-career and they can be like, oh, that's the thing I'm gonna go get because everybody says that's important. I'm gonna go shoot at that thing and I know there's gonna be space for me because someone has said these are the rules, right? This is the thing we're shooting at. And so as opposed to, what does bio-based economy mean really granularly, really specifically? So this is gonna mean, are we gonna shorten the space between where the food is grown and where the food is eaten? And how are we gonna do these sorts of things? For me, a real nice set of rules is real handy.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like we're at the point where we're trying to build a framework, and there are so many components that are going into this, from understanding stakeholders and consumers to how this translates to policy to infrastructure, that someone needs to get into a room with one person from each of these areas and start talking about and setting these real milestones, making sense of it all.
Or 10 people from these areas.
Yeah.
Make it broad and big.
We can make it bigger. So, and with that, I just wanted to thank our audience, both here and online, and I hope you've enjoyed our panel discussion on the bioeconomy today.
All right.